For our lecture today, we are going to go over the importance of Italian Renaissance gardens by diving into the specific key elements and symbolism that is found throughout this time period. This presentation was created by Sarah Bishop, Kylie Drews, Belinda Perez, and Emily Puga. In today's lecture, we are going to go through the Italian Renaissance period in 4 stages. First being the introduction, where we discuss a little bit of the history of the Renaissance time period and how the Italian Renaissance came into being. Next, we will be going over the analysis of the garden spaces, specifically how Alberti influenced the style of the Italian Renaissance gardens. After going through a quick analysis of the time period, we will discuss how common elements found in the garden design, along with the architecture symbolism, and how the symbolism was connected to the people's culture. We will conclude with our observations on the Renaissance time period and re-emphasize the impact Alberti made during this time period. So to begin, I want to emphasize the cultural movement that occurred during the 14th century all the way through the 17th century. Beginning in Florence, Italy, this cultural movement transitions people's way of thinking from religious reasoning to the logicality of science. Because they were so focused on the science behind it all and how science specifically worked, their architecture was designed based on mathematical ideas. The picture in the top right area of this slide is the Vitruvian Man. The Vitruvian Man was created by Leonardo da Vinci to show the realistic body proportions of a normal man. The word Renaissance is commonly derived from the idea of something being reborn. In this instance, there was a rebirth in different ideas and inventions. For example, the printing press is a common example of an influential invention because it allowed people to communicate their knowledge much faster. If it weren't for the printing press, people would not have been able to share their ideas of different things that they had made or wanted to make. This rebirth of ideas also created a change in their architecture and art pieces. Sculptures had become a common thing that people had not seen before this time period, and people started measuring their art pieces in different architectural elements, which was a huge advancement during this time because sculptures started to look more realistic and proportional. Measuring was also super important during this time period because the Renaissance was all about the human form and human needs. So if something was not measured accurately, it would look weird because the human body is pretty proportional. The importance of human proportionality was reflected in their architecture, so the buildings began to look more proportional and symmetrical, which was a new aspect in the creation of architecture.
Leon Battista Alberti was he was the father of Italian Renaissance gardens, and he had principles to build these gardens. He drew upon the architectural principles of Vitruvius. So Vitruvius identified 3 principles to good architecture. Formatus was strength in Italian, utilitas was utility, sorry, and Venus status was beauty. And so Alberti was one of the foremost theorists on Renaissance architecture and art, and he incorporated art into his principles for gardens, and he codified the principles of the linear perspective. And so some examples of this are private landscapes. So this is one example. This is the Pienza and Palazzo Piccolomini in Italy. So the Renaissance had many unique qualities. This Renaissance garden, the main feature was the Giardino Segreto, and this is a private garden, and it's in the center of the site, so it's connected to a villa, and it's surrounded by stone walls, so there's limited access. It's a private landscape, so it's only for the owner who was wealthy enough to build and design an intricate landscape. There's also a lot of defined like shaped bushes, topiary. There's spherical shapes, and there's also squares, as we can see here, and everything is on this axis in the middle, which in the center of the axis is a small water feature. And Italian private landscapes also had a lot of water features in their gardens as well. This is also another example of a private landscape. This is these are the gardens of Via Albrandini and Frascati in Italy. So this is built in 1603, and it was originally built for entertainment purposes. It features a 27,000 square foot nymphaeum with fountains and terraces. As we can see here, this is the example on the bottom. So this example on the top is your view from when you walk up to the main house, the main villa. And so the villa, since it's on a hill, it has a really good viewing point of the rest of the gardens. You can basically see everything. You can see your topiary, you can see your layering, and it's really nice because from every angle, it has a really nice view. So it plays on the principles of Alberti because it follows the actual planning design. This is also another private landscape. This is Via Medici in Fiesole in Italy. This is actually one of the oldest Renaissance gardens, and it's a hillside garden. It overlooks Florence, and it also follows the Alberti principles. There are two terraces, as we can see in this example. And since it's a hillside garden, you have a bunch of places to look or that overlook the garden. So you can see how the layering of the trees and the stonework really plays into that opulent and luxurious factor. And Alberti's principles, he stated that villas should be looked at and they should also have a place to look from. So this is a really good example because you can also see the villa and you can see your garden below, and it's elevated as well. So the owners can admire basically their work and what was built. And the garden, as we can see, also has two large terraces. This is an example of one of the public landscapes. There's not a lot of greenery in the public landscape. This is actually the Piazza Ducale in the city of Vigevano. Piazzas were public spaces and they were most popular throughout the Renaissance era. That's where people gathered and that's where they set up shops. And there's also seating areas that kind of lined the area as well. There's a lot of art that was incorporated and design that was incorporated into the piazzas. As you can see here, it's not just a drab piazza, it's beautiful. There's a lot of stonework and on the ground and in the buildings. The arches are very intricate and there's a lot of designs that were etched into the stone. So even though they were beautiful and they were pretty luxurious and opulent, they were also able to be utilized, which is a factor that was really important in the Renaissance era. So the function of Italian landscapes, this example is in Lake Como, Italy. It's the Via d'Este in Lake Como, Italy. This example shows a lot of wealth. This is actually a very popular site for very wealthy people now as well. So there's a lot of stonework, and the wealthy Italian aristocrats, they love to show affluence, especially during this time. Italy was very wealthy because of the Renaissance boom, and you had a lot of art, you had a lot of scientific discoveries. So the Italians really played up on that in their designs of their houses and their gardens. So this garden it was intended for viewing pleasure. As you can see in the middle, there's an elevated space to where you can kind of walk down and look at the garden, and this functioned as a private oasis for the owners, and it was really nice because there's a lot of layering incorporated in this garden. So even though there's a lot of plants and layering, everything is shaped in a way to where you can see each factor. So that really played up on like the private oasis and paradise feel. So this is one of the grand scale gardens. This is actually the largest Italian Renaissance garden. It's Parco Giardino Sigarda, and this is the largest Italian Renaissance garden at 600,000 square meters. It's pretty big. It was built in 1617, and it also emulates luxury by lush layering techniques, as you can kind of see here. There's water features, there's a bunch of trees surrounding those water features. Even on your walkways, you have a bunch of flowers that line both sides, and then you have trees that are behind that. And then you also have certain cypress trees that are taller than those plants. So it creates a lot of nice layering, and it attunes to, it's appealing to the eye basically. And that's what the Italians were kind of trying to play up on during this time. So the Italians had an intricate relationship with their gardens, and they loved to signify their wealth. So during this time, there was an immense boom with luxury and opulence, and it was derived, a lot of these designs were derived from classical Roman models. They integrated the five senses into their design. So on the right, we have two examples. This is these two examples are both located in Lake Como, Italy. They're also Lake Como, Italy is also one of the wealthiest places in Italy, so it really plays up on the surrounding and the scenery. So they integrated the five senses. As you can see in the example on the left, there's a lot of plants and there's a lot of flowers. So you can smell the flowers, you can see everything, you can touch the bushes, you can hear the sounds of like the water fountains, and you can also see how everything kind of plays up on each other. So spatial organization was really important in Italian gardens. Axial symmetry planning was commonly used during the Italian Renaissance period. And in order to create certain viewing angles, elements had to be built on an axis. This example is the Violante Gardens in Italy. This is a clear example of an axis. You can see there's a pathway in the middle right here, and then it opens up to this large water fountain that's in the middle of all of your topiary, which is really nice. So if I'm in the corner, I can see basically everything. If I'm in the middle, I can also see everything. So based on where you stand, you can see every element of the garden, which kind of plays up on Alberti's principles as well.
So now we're going to be talking about land elements and how they were used within design for Renaissance gardens. So Renaissance designers used a lot of vegetation, water, and even used the landform itself to integrate a interesting pattern for their designs. So for vegetation, it had different uses and symbolism within Renaissance gardens. And one of the most popular design inclusions was boscos, which were thick informal graves of evergreen trees, like seen in the picture behind. They symbolize wilderness and were often used for hunting purposes. And they were also heavily manicured, as like the shapes of the walls and the hedges and bushes, they were heavily shaped to be round and not their natural form. So for vegetation, this is an example of heavy manipulation within Italian Renaissance gardens. This is a Villa Gambaria in Italy. The hedges and walls surrounding the garden itself were shaped strategically, and you can see how they kept the lawn short, and everything was just heavily manicured and shaped. So water was another main element used within Renaissance gardens. The main function of them was for irrigation for the different plants within the garden, but fountains, streams, and ponds were introduced, and they added beauty to the garden and enhanced the pleasure experience of the visitor. So these two images are examples from the Isolata Boboldi gardens in Italy. Within the Isolata Gardens, there's a fountain of the ocean by Gambolona, which is a large fountain at the center of the Isolato, and the fountain itself is a sculpture of Neptune and water deities, and it adds a really nice touch and intricate piece to the center of the entire garden. So here's another example of water use within gardens. This is the water chain cascade fountain of dolphins at Violante in Italy. The cascade is coming from the very top of the hill from a fountain source and travels all the way down through this uniquely shaped channel, and it adds a really interesting experience for the visitor.
So for land elements, another part of this was land forms. The Renaissance experienced a high level of experimentation with the original topography of the land for their gardens. Much like the gardens at the Villa Medici Fiesoli, which Sarah talked about, terraces were something that were very common because they made use of these large spaces that were sometimes attached to the villas, and also made sure that land on hills was used efficiently so that a beautiful view was created of the garden and also of the villa and the surrounding city or landscape. Another example is the Sacro Bosco in Italy, which was a bizarre sculpture garden. This image, the scary face here, is from the Sacro Bosco. It had many hills and changes in topography throughout the garden. It aimed at creating a certain uncanny feeling towards the natural topography, which was a part of which is interesting because human manipulation and was a big part of the Renaissance, and kind of everything was centered around humans. So I think this is a good example of how kind of control of the landscape was displayed. So after discussing all these frameworks, we can really dive into the symbolism that was created with the use of all these elements. So since the Renaissance was a rebirth of ideas and art, these gardens explored the connection between God, man, and nature. They were a reflection of their owners' and curators' interests and lifestyles. The gardens were often a physical manifestation of the intellectual and aesthetic qualities that the owners or institutions wanted represented. Some of these included family history, mythological ideas, wealth, oftentimes, was demonstrated as well through expensive features and collections. Exotic plants, animals, and rocks could also display knowledge and expertise. The example that I want to talk about to discuss symbolism is the Villa d'Este in Tivoli, which is a really grand example of Italian Renaissance garden. It belonged to the Cardinal Ippolito d'Este, who was appointed governor of the town in 1550 and received the villa as a gift. The central axis, which we can see in this left image, told the myths of the journey of Hercules. It cuts through the Fountain of Dragons, which can be interpreted as Hercules stealing the golden apples of Hesperides. Statues along the way of the central axis also relate to Hercules' journey, which can essentially be experienced if a visitor would walk through the central axis towards the main building. There was geographic symbolism as well. The oval fountain is a metaphorical representation of the Apennine Mountains. Above the oval fountain is also an artificial mountain with 3 grottos representing the rivers of Tivoli. The Fountain of Rometa in the top right is a representation of Rome, which includes elements such as the Tiber River, the Tiber Island, the gates of Rome, and the main temples of Rome. The 2 fountains, the oval fountain and the Rometa fountain, are connected by the Avenue of 100 Fountains, which their connection represents the way that the river Aniene connects the 2 places in real life. So for our contemporary design, I wanted to discuss the Hamilton Gardens in New Zealand. The 3 aspects that they really resembled from the Renaissance gardens were symmetry and geometry, water features, and axis and perspective. So the Hamilton Gardens made this specifically to be a replication of Italian Renaissance gardens, as they display like many different cultural gardens of the last 4,000 years. So symmetry and geography were really emphasized through these harsh kind of square boundaries of plants that we can see surrounding the fountain and also on top of the fountains. Water features we know were used a lot in Italian gardens in the form of fountains, grottos, and ponds, and we can see this precisely in the middle of this garden. And lastly, axis and perspective. So Italian Renaissance gardens were often laid out along a central axis with focal points such as fountains and statues organized along them, which we can see here exactly. So this axis also creates a beautiful perspective and vista when entering and traversing the garden, as we can see for the visitors that are visiting this space.
So there are several elements from Italian Renaissance architecture that are incorporated into modern architecture. Common architectural elements that are found in modern-day architecture are columns, domes, and arches. Italy's topography was naturally hilly, which meant that gardens were built on many different levels. Today, gardens have porticos on higher level ground that produce shade where one can sit and enjoy the view of the garden. De Re Edificatoria, written by Alberti, is still used today to create gardens based on the Italian Renaissance time period. Overall, Italian Renaissance architecture is beautiful on both buildings and throughout garden areas. It is not surprising that architects still use this style of architecture because there are many elements that are from this time period that make a courtyard a different kind of beautiful. So these are the citations that we use to create this presentation. Thank you for listening to our presentation, and we hope you enjoyed our little bit of information on Italian Renaissance gardens.